He thought denying her a seat was harmless. But within minutes, his entire career would begin to unravel in a silence he could never escape. Sophia Bennett stepped into Terminal B just after 8:15 a.m., her footsteps soft against the polished marble floors that reflected the golden morning light pouring through the towering glass windows. Around her, the airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of rolling suitcases, distant boarding announcements, and hurried conversations, yet Sophia moved differently. Unrushed, composed, almost invisible to the chaos that swallowed everyone else. She wore a simple beige coat over a white blouse, paired with modest slacks and worn leather flats that had clearly seen years of use. There was nothing about her appearance that demanded attention, nothing that suggested status or wealth, and yet her posture remained steady, her gaze calm, as if she carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be announced. She approached the first-class check-in counter with a small carry-on in hand, pausing briefly as she glanced at the departure board overhead. Flight 247 to New York. On time. A small, almost imperceptible nod followed, as though she had already calculated every step of her morning long before arriving. Behind the counter stood Mark Reynolds, a man in his early 30s with a sharply pressed uniform and a name badge that gleamed under the overhead lights. He had the practiced smile of someone trained to serve, but his eyes told a different story, quick, assessing, measuring people in seconds, and placing them into invisible categories that dictated how much respect they deserved. When Sophia stepped forward, his smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, replaced by something colder, something dismissive that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Good morning," Sophia said softly, placing her ticket on the counter. Her voice was calm, polite, without a trace of entitlement. "I'd like to inquire about upgrading to first class if there are any seats available." Mark's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but instead of typing, his eyes moved slowly from her shoes to her coat, then back to her face. It was a glance that lasted no more than 2 seconds, yet it carried a judgment that felt far heavier. He let out a small breath through his nose, the kind that barely registered as a sound but spoke volumes in tone. "First class," he repeated, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper underneath. "Yes," Sophia replied, maintaining the same steady composure. "If there's availability, I'm happy to pay the difference." For a moment, Mark said nothing. He leaned slightly against the counter, tilting his head just enough to signal doubt without saying it outright. Behind Sophia, a line had begun to form. Business travelers in tailored suits, a woman in designer sunglasses scrolling through her phone, a young couple whispering impatiently. The atmosphere shifted subtly, as if the space itself was waiting to see how this interaction would unfold. Mark finally tapped a few keys, though the motion felt more performative than necessary. "I'm afraid first class is in high demand," he said, his tone carrying a rehearsed politeness that didn't quite reach his eyes. He paused, then added, "It's typically reserved for our premium clientele." The words hung in the air, light in delivery, but heavy in implication. Sophia didn't react immediately. She simply nodded once, as though acknowledging the statement without accepting its meaning. Her fingers rested lightly on the counter, and for a brief second, the sleeve of her coat shifted just enough to reveal a simple wedding band. Unadorned, understated, easy to overlook unless someone was truly paying attention. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I'd still like to check if there's availability." Mark's smile tightened, and this time, it didn't bother to hide the faint trace of condescension beneath it. He glanced past her, briefly acknowledging the well-dressed passengers waiting behind, then returned his gaze to Sophia with a look that suggested the conversation was already decided. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "First class isn't for everyone." And just like that, the air around them changed. Conversations softened. Movement slowed. A subtle hush began to settle over the surrounding space, as if the moment had quietly announced itself to everyone within earshot. Sophia remained still, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as though she had heard something far more familiar than surprising. And somewhere beyond the glass doors of the terminal, unseen and unnoticed, the next piece of the story was already walking toward them. The words lingered longer than Mark expected, stretching into the quiet space between them as the line behind Sophia shifted uncomfortably, a few passengers exchanging glances that carried equal parts curiosity and silent judgment. Mark straightened slightly, as if reaffirming his authority behind the counter, his fingers now tapping more decisively against the keyboard, though the screen in front of him remained unchanged. As I mentioned, he continued, his tone sharpening just enough to draw attention. First-class seating is typically prioritized for frequent flyers and executive members. It is not simply a matter of paying for an upgrade at the last minute. A man in a navy suit behind Sophia let out a faint chuckle, quickly masking it as a cough when he realized others had noticed. The woman beside him adjusted her designer handbag, her eyes flicking between Sophia and Mark with thinly veiled interest. The atmosphere had shifted from routine to spectacle, and though no one spoke openly, the tension was now shared among strangers who had unknowingly become an audience. Sophia did not turn around. She did not acknowledge the subtle reactions behind her. Instead, she kept her gaze on Mark, her expression composed, her voice steady when she spoke again. "I understand your policy," she said gently. "I am simply asking if there are any available seats. If there are none, that is perfectly fine." There was no challenge in her tone, no trace of frustration, only clarity. And yet, something about her calm seemed to irritate Mark more than any argument could have. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, though not enough to prevent others from hearing. "Ma'am, I think you are misunderstanding the situation," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "Even if there were available seats, upgrades are not always granted to walk-in requests, especially when the demand is selective." The pause before the last word was subtle, but intentional. It landed like a quiet accusation, one that did not need to be explained to be understood. Sophia's fingers shifted slightly on the counter, brushing against the edge of her ticket. For a brief moment, her thumb traced the paper as if grounding herself in something tangible. Then she lifted her hand, adjusting the strap of her bag with a small, controlled movement. "Selective," she repeated softly, as though considering the word rather than reacting to it. "That is an interesting way to describe availability." Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was no longer simply denying a request. He was now defending a stance, and the distinction mattered. "It is how the airline operates," he replied, his tone firmer now, the polite veneer beginning to crack at the edges. "We maintain a certain standard for our first-class experience." Another pause followed, heavier this time, as if the unspoken part of his sentence hung just out of reach, waiting for someone to complete it. Sophia nodded once more, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. Around them, the quiet had deepened. Even the rolling suitcases seemed to move more softly, their wheels muffled against the polished floor. An announcement echoed faintly overhead, calling passengers to a different gate, but it felt distant, disconnected from the moment unfolding at the counter. "I see," Sophia said. Her voice remained calm, but there was something different now, something almost reflective. "So the standard is not only about the seat, but about the person sitting in it." Mark exhaled sharply through his nose, a faint sign of impatience breaking through his controlled exterior. "It is about maintaining the quality of service our premium clients expect," he corrected, though the distinction did little to soften the implication. Behind Sophia, the man in the navy suit shifted again, this time stepping slightly to the side as if trying to get a better view. A young airport employee nearby paused mid-step, pretending to check a clipboard while clearly listening. The moment had grown too precise, too deliberate to ignore. Sophia's gaze did not waver. For a fraction of a second, her eyes flicked downward, not in submission, but in thought. Her hand moved again, this time resting briefly over her wedding band, her fingers stilling there, as if drawing quiet strength from something unseen. When she looked back up, her expression had not hardened, but it had settled into something resolute. "Thank you for clarifying," she said. No sarcasm, no anger, just acknowledgement. Mark opened his mouth as if to respond, but stopped. Something in her tone had shifted the balance of the conversation in a way he could not immediately place. It was not defiance, not exactly. It was certainty. And certainty, when it came from someone he had already dismissed, was unsettling. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thin but unbroken, until the sound of the terminal doors sliding open in the distance cut through the stillness. A subtle change in the air followed, almost imperceptible, like the quiet before something significant arrives. And though no one at the counter turned to look, the next moment was already moving toward them, steady and inevitable. The sliding glass doors whispered open with a soft mechanical breath, and a subtle shift moved through the terminal like a change in weather, barely noticeable at first yet impossible to ignore once it settled. Footsteps followed, measured and deliberate, echoing faintly across the polished floor with a rhythm that carried quiet authority. A few heads turned instinctively, not because they recognized the man entering, but because something in his presence suggested he was not just another traveler rushing to catch a flight. He moved with calm precision, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him effortlessly, his posture straight, his gaze focused yet unhurried. In one hand, he held a phone, lowering it as he stepped further into the terminal, his attention shifting toward the check-in area as if drawn by something unseen. At the counter, Mark remained unaware, still anchored behind his screen, though the tension in front of him had not eased. Sophia stood exactly as before, her composure unbroken, her silence no longer passive but intentional, as though she had already stepped beyond the moment that had tried to diminish her. The line behind her had grown quieter, the earlier whispers fading into a watchful stillness that felt almost anticipatory. Mark cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the interaction, though a faint edge of irritation now lingered in his movements. "If there is nothing further," he said, gesturing lightly toward the side as if to dismiss the situation, "I would appreciate it if we could keep the line moving. Other passengers are waiting." The words were polite on the surface, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. "Move aside. You do not belong here." Sophia's eyes remained steady, and for a brief moment, she said nothing. Then, with a quiet breath, she reached for her ticket, her fingers brushing against the paper as she lifted it from the counter. It would have been easy to step away, to accept the moment for what it appeared to be and disappear back into the flow of travelers who had already decided her place without knowing her name. But she did not move. Instead, she held the ticket lightly between her fingers, her gaze still fixed on Mark, her expression unchanged. "I will not take much more of your time," she said calmly. There was no challenge in her voice, no raised tone, only a quiet certainty that seemed to settle deeper into the space between them. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience thinning in a way he could no longer fully conceal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firmer now, "I have already explained the policy. There is nothing more to discuss." A faint murmur rippled through the line, quickly silenced as the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, sharper now against the marble floor. The man who had entered moments earlier slowed as he neared the check-in area, his eyes scanning the scene with a level of attention that was anything but casual. He did not interrupt. He did not announce himself. He simply observed, his gaze settling on Sophia first, then shifting to Mark, taking in the posture, the tone, the subtle imbalance that had unfolded in plain view. Sophia did not turn, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, as though she had sensed his presence without needing to see it. Her hand moved again, briefly resting against her wedding band, her fingers stilling there for just a second before falling back to her side. Mark noticed the movement this time, his eyes flicking downward, then back up, his expression tightening with a confusion he could not quite place. "Is there anything else?" he asked, the question now carrying a trace of impatience rather than courtesy. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening, not in submission, but in quiet reflection. "No," she said. "You have made your position very clear." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that lingered longer than expected. Behind her, the man in the navy suit shifted again, this time stepping back slightly, as if sensing that something was about to change. The young employee with the clipboard lowered it just enough to watch openly now, no longer pretending to be occupied. And then, from just a few feet away, a calm voice entered the space, steady and unmistakably composed. "I would like to understand that position as well." The words were not loud, but they carried effortlessly, cutting through the tension without force. Mark turned instinctively, his expression already forming the polite smile he reserved for customers he deemed important. But the moment his eyes landed on the man standing there, that smile faltered. Just for a second. Just long enough for something deeper to surface beneath it. The man stepped forward, his presence now fully within the circle of attention that had formed around the counter. His gaze moved briefly to Sophia, softening in a way that contrasted sharply with the controlled intensity in his eyes, before returning to Mark. And in that brief exchange, without a single word spoken between them, the balance of the entire moment began to shift. Mark's expression froze in a way that was almost imperceptible, the kind of stillness that only revealed itself in the smallest details, the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint hesitation in his breath, the way his posture straightened just a fraction too late. He blinked once, then quickly recovered, his professional smile snapping back into place like a reflex he had practiced 1,000 times. "Sir," he said, his tone shifting instantly, smoother now, more attentive. "How can I assist you today?" The man did not answer immediately. He stepped closer, closing the distance to the counter with measured ease, his presence calm, but undeniable. Up close, there was something about him that did not need explanation, not the suit, not the watch, not even the quiet confidence in his posture, but something deeper, something that made the air feel more deliberate around him. His gaze remained on Mark, steady and unwavering, as if he were not just listening to words, but weighing the meaning behind them. "You mentioned a policy," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, carrying a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "I would like to hear it again." The words were simple, but they landed differently this time, not as a question, but as a request that expected precision. Mark shifted his weight slightly, his fingers brushing the edge of the keyboard, as if searching for something familiar to hold on to. "Of course," he replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Our first-class upgrades are typically reserved for premium clients and frequent flyers. We maintain a standard to ensure the quality of experience for those passengers." As he spoke, his eyes flicked briefly towards Sophia, then back to the man, as if trying to recalibrate the situation in real time. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, though there was a subtle narrowing in his eyes, not of anger, but of focus. When Mark finished, a quiet pause followed, stretching just long enough to make the silence feel intentional. "And how do you determine who meets that standard?" the man asked. There was no accusation in his tone, no raised voice, only a calm inquiry that seemed to strip the situation down to its core. Mark hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "It is based on membership status, booking history, and overall customer profile," he said, choosing his words carefully now, as though each one required more thought than before. The man nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, then glanced briefly at Sophia. His expression softened for the smallest fraction of a moment, a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them without words, before his attention returned to Mark. "Customer profile," he repeated, almost thoughtfully. "That is a broad term." The tension at the counter deepened, though no one moved. The line behind Sophia had completely stilled now, every pair of eyes fixed on the exchange. Even the ambient noise of the terminal seemed to fade, as if the space itself had drawn a boundary around the moment. Mark cleared his throat, a faint bead of pressure forming beneath his composed exterior. "It is part of our internal guidelines," he said, "to ensure that our first-class environment remains consistent." The last word came out softer than intended, as though even he recognized how it sounded when spoken aloud. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, then let out a quiet breath, not of frustration, but of understanding. "I see," he said. And then, with a slight shift in his posture, something changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried weight. He stepped half a pace closer, his presence now fully commanding the space without raising his voice or altering his tone. "Then allow me to clarify something for you," he continued. "Consistency is not defined by appearance." The words settled into the air with quiet precision. No force, no aggression, just truth, delivered in a way that left no room to ignore it. Mark's expression tightened again, uncertainty flickering across his face as he searched for the right response, the right tone, the right way to regain control of a situation that was no longer his to manage. "Sir, I assure you, we are simply following," he began. But the man raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause the explanation before it could continue. It was a small gesture, yet it carried a finality that stopped the sentence mid-thought. For a brief second, Everything held still. Then the man spoke again, his voice just as calm as before, but now carrying a quiet authority that resonated far beyond the counter. "Tell me," he said, "when did this airline begin deciding who belongs in first class based on perception rather than policy?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, undeniable. And for the first time since the interaction began, Mark had no immediate reply. The room did not erupt. No one spoke. But the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was heavy, deliberate, and filled with the unmistakable sense that something had just shifted beyond repair. Mark's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, the words he had prepared dissolving before they could take shape. The question lingered in the air, precise and unyielding, leaving no room for the practiced responses he had relied on moments earlier. Around them, the silence deepened, no longer just a pause in conversation, but something heavier, something that demanded acknowledgement. Mark shifted his stance, his confidence slipping in subtle ways he could no longer mask. "Sir," he began again, his tone carefully measured, though the edge of uncertainty was now unmistakable. "We follow company guidelines to ensure. Guidelines are written to serve people." The man interrupted gently, not raising his voice, but redirecting the conversation with quiet authority. Not to exclude them based on assumption. The words did not strike like a confrontation. They settled instead, calm and deliberate, making resistance feel unnecessary, almost unreasonable. Mark swallowed, his throat tightening as he glanced once more at Sophia, then quickly away, as if the very act of looking at her now carried a different weight. Something in the room had shifted, something that made his earlier certainty feel misplaced. "I did not intend to exclude anyone," he said, though the defense sounded thinner than he intended. "I was simply maintaining the standard expected by our first-class passengers." The man studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with a level of attention that felt far more unsettling. "And what standard is that?" he asked quietly. "Is it professionalism, courtesy, or is it something less defined?" Mark hesitated again, the answer no longer as simple as it had seemed before. Behind Sophia, the line of passengers remained frozen, no one stepping forward, no one breaking the moment. Even those who had once seemed impatient now stood still, as if aware that they were witnessing something far more significant than a delayed check-in. Sophia remained silent throughout, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, yet there was a quiet strength in her stillness that had grown more visible with each passing second. She did not need to speak. The moment had already begun to speak for her. The man turned slightly, his gaze moving from Mark to Sophia, and for the first time, there was a warmth in his expression that contrasted with the controlled intensity he had shown before. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it carried meaning. Then he looked back at Mark, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm certainty, but now with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "This woman asked a simple question," he said. "She did not demand special treatment. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked if there was availability." Each sentence was measured, deliberate, building not in volume, but in weight. And in return, she was evaluated not by policy, but by perception. Mark's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the counter, his composure slipping further as the realization began to settle in. "That was not my intention," he repeated, though the words now felt like an echo rather than a defense. The man nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement without fully accepting it. "Intent does not erase impact," he said. The phrase landed softly, yet it carried a finality that resonated through the silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with a subtle shift in his stance, the man reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, yet it drew every eye in the vicinity. Mark watched closely, a faint crease forming between his brows, uncertainty tightening his expression as he tried to anticipate what would come next. The man withdrew a slim leather wallet, opening it with practiced ease before placing a single card gently on the counter. It was a small gesture, quiet, almost understated, yet it carried a gravity that seemed to pull the entire moment into focus. Mark's gaze dropped to the card, his eyes scanning it quickly at first, then again, slower this time. The change in his expression was immediate, subtle, but undeniable. His posture straightened abruptly, his shoulders pulling back as if responding to an invisible command. The confidence that had once defined his stance was gone, replaced by something far more rigid, far more cautious. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer filled with anticipation. It was filled with realization. And though no one had spoken the truth aloud yet, it was already beginning to take shape in every face that watched, in every breath that held, in every second that stretched just a little longer than it should have. Mark looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the man's once more, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal left in them. Only recognition, and the quiet understanding that everything he had assumed just moments ago had been wrong. Mark's fingers trembled ever so slightly as they hovered above the card, the polished surface reflecting the overhead lights in a way that suddenly felt far too bright. He read the name once, then again, slower this time, as if hoping the letters might rearrange themselves into something less consequential. But they did not. The title beneath the name remained exactly as it was, clear, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. His breath caught, just for a fraction of a second, before he straightened abruptly, the shift in his posture so sharp it drew even more attention from those watching. "Sir, he began, but the words failed him, dissolving into the weight of realization that now pressed firmly against his composure. The man did not react to the hesitation. He simply stood there, calm, composed, his gaze steady, giving Mark all the time he needed to understand what was already evident. Around them, the silence deepened into something almost tangible. The man in the navy suit behind Sophia lowered his eyes, suddenly far more interested in his phone than the unfolding scene. The young employee with the clipboard stood frozen, no longer pretending to work, her expression caught between disbelief and quiet awe. Even the ambient sounds of the terminal seemed distant now, as if the world beyond the counter had momentarily paused. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak again, though his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. "Mr. Bennett," he said carefully, the name now carrying a respect that had been absent. "Just moments ago, I was not aware." "That is clear," the man replied gently, not interrupting, but finishing the thought with quiet precision. There was no anger in his tone, no raised voice, only a calm acknowledgement that made the truth feel heavier than any accusation could. Mark's grip tightened slightly against the edge of the counter, his mind racing through the last few minutes, replaying each word, each glance, each assumption with growing clarity. What had seemed routine now felt irreversible. "I sincerely apologize," he continued quickly, the words coming faster now, urgency replacing arrogance. "If there has been any misunderstanding, I can certainly arrange the upgrade immediately. We would be happy to accommodate. That will not be necessary," the man said. The response was immediate, but not dismissive. It was measured, intentional, and final. Mark froze again, his prepared solution halted mid-offer. The man's gaze shifted briefly to Sophia, softening in a way that spoke of familiarity, of respect, of something deeper than the moment itself. Then he looked back at Mark, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet authority that settled over the space like a final verdict. "She asked for a seat," he said, "not for permission to be treated with respect." The words landed without force, yet they carried a weight that silenced even the smallest movement in the surrounding area. Mark's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in his stance giving way to something closer to humility. For the first time, he truly looked at Sophia, not as a profile to be assessed, not as a category to be placed, but as a person standing directly in front of him. And in that moment, the difference was unmistakable. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice no longer projecting authority, but seeking understanding, "I apologize for how I handled this. That was not appropriate." Sophia met his gaze, her expression calm, unchanged, yet there was a quiet clarity in her eyes that had not been there before. She did not rush to accept the apology. She did not reject it either. She simply allowed the moment to settle, as though measuring its sincerity without needing to question it aloud. "Thank you," she said after a brief pause, her tone even, composed. There was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction, only acknowledgement. The man beside her remained still, his presence no longer imposing, but grounded, as if the purpose of his arrival had already been fulfilled. Around them, The tension began to ease, though the silence remained, now transformed into something reflective rather than expectant. Mark glanced once more at the card on the counter, then carefully slid it back toward the man, his movements deliberate, respectful. "If there is anything else I can do to assist," he said, choosing his words with care, "please let me know." The man took the card without looking down, his attention still on Mark, as if ensuring that the lesson of the moment had fully taken hold. Then, with a small nod, he turned slightly, his gaze returning to Sophia. And though no one spoke, the shift was complete. What had begun as a quiet dismissal had become something else entirely. Something that could not be undone. Something that would not be forgotten. And in the stillness that followed, the entire terminal seemed to remember what respect was supposed to look like. The tension did not disappear all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled free from fabric that had been stretched too tight for too long. The silence remained, but it no longer pressed down with discomfort. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something reflective, as if every person within earshot had just witnessed a moment that demanded more than a passing glance. Mark stood behind the counter, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but grounded in something closer to awareness. His hands rested lightly on the surface in front of him, no longer gripping for control, no longer performing for perception. For the first time since Sophia had approached, he looked at her without calculation, without assumption, simply seeing her as she was. The shift was subtle, but it was complete. Sophia adjusted the strap of her bag, her movements unhurried, her composure unchanged. She did not linger on the moment, did not seek acknowledgement from those around her, yet the presence she carried had grown unmistakable. It was not power in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, something rooted in certainty, in knowing who she was regardless of how others chose to see her. Beside her, the man who had stepped into the moment with such quiet authority remained still, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, his voice no longer addressing the room, but only her. Sophia nodded once, a small, simple gesture that carried everything it needed to. "Yes," she replied. No hesitation. No need for explanation. Just clarity. Mark watched the exchange, something shifting deeper within him as he observed the ease between them, the unspoken understanding that required no display, no validation. He cleared his throat lightly, stepping forward just enough to re-engage, though his tone was now entirely different from before. "Ms. Bennett," he said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate respect, "your seat has been confirmed. First class, as requested." He paused briefly, then added, "Please allow me to personally ensure everything is arranged for your comfort." There was no trace of condescension left, no attempt to regain authority, only a genuine effort to correct what had been mishandled. Sophia met his gaze once more, her expression calm, her voice steady. "Thank you," she said. Again, no triumph, no lingering resentment, just acknowledgement. The man beside her gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as recognition that the moment had reached its natural conclusion. He did not need to say more. The lesson had already been delivered, not through force, but through presence, through clarity, through a truth that had revealed itself without raising its voice. Around them, the stillness began to break, slowly at first, then more naturally as people shifted back into motion. The man in the navy suit stepped forward in line, his earlier impatience replaced by a quiet restraint. The woman with the designer handbag lowered her sunglasses, her expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering something she could not quite put into words. Even the young employee with the clipboard exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing as she returned to her task, though her eyes lingered for just a moment longer before she looked away. The world resumed, but not exactly as it had been before. Mark stepped out from behind the counter, an action that drew a few surprised glances, and gestured toward the first-class boarding area with a professionalism that now carried sincerity rather than performance. "This way, please," he said. Sophia began to walk, her steps measured, her presence steady, as if nothing about the moment had altered her path, only clarified it. The man walked beside her, not leading, not following, simply present. As they moved away from the counter, the distance between them and the earlier moment grew, yet its impact remained, etched quietly into the space they left behind. Mark watched them go for a brief second longer, his expression thoughtful, the weight of what had just occurred settling into something that would not fade quickly. He turned back to his station, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if every interaction that followed would carry a different awareness than before. And in the soft hum of the terminal, beneath the rolling wheels and distant announcements, there lingered something unspoken, something simple yet undeniable. Respect, once overlooked, had made itself visible, and those who had witnessed it would not forget how easily it had been given, and how quietly it had been reclaimed. The first-class lounge doors opened with a quiet glide, revealing a space that seemed untouched by the noise and urgency of the terminal outside. Soft lighting reflected off polished wood and glass, and the low murmur of conversation blended seamlessly with the distant hum of espresso machines and the faint clink of porcelain cups. Sophia stepped inside without hesitation, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, as though the transition from public scrutiny to private comfort carried no weight for her at all. The man beside her moved with the same calm presence, his attention briefly scanning the room before settling back on her, ensuring without words that everything was as it should be. A lounge attendant approached immediately, her posture attentive, her smile genuine, yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor as she recognized him. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said, her tone respectful but warm, as though greeting someone whose presence was both familiar and significant. "Welcome back." The acknowledgement was quiet, but it did not go unnoticed by the few guests seated nearby. A man seated near the window lowered his newspaper slightly, his eyes lingering just long enough to register recognition before he quickly returned to his reading. Another guest, a woman in a tailored suit, paused mid-conversation, her voice trailing off as she observed the interaction with a new level of awareness. Sophia glanced briefly at the attendant, offering a small nod of appreciation, but her focus remained grounded, unshaken by the subtle shifts around her. "Thank you," she said softly. There was no change in her tone, no added formality, only the same quiet composure she had carried from the moment she entered the terminal. The attendant gestured toward a seating area near the windows, where sunlight filtered through in soft, diffused patterns across the floor. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. If there is anything you need, I will be right here." As Sophia moved toward the seating area, the man walked beside her, his presence steady but unobtrusive. Once they reached the chairs, he paused, allowing her to sit first before taking the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the lounge wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the tension they had left behind, yet the silence between them felt different, not empty, but complete. Sophia placed her bag gently beside her chair, her fingers brushing against the fabric as she settled in. Then she looked up at him, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful. "You did not have to step in," she said, her voice calm, not questioning, but acknowledging. He met her gaze, a faint smile forming, not of amusement, but of understanding. "I know," he replied, "but I could not stand there and say nothing." There was no pride in his words, no sense of intervention as a display of power. It was simply a statement of choice, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Sophia nodded slightly, her eyes softening for just a second before returning to their usual calm. "You rarely say nothing," she said quietly, a hint of familiarity in her tone. He let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, though it carried no sound. "Only when silence is enough," he answered. The exchange was simple, yet it revealed more than the entire interaction at the counter ever could. There was no need to revisit what had happened, no need to analyze it or assign meaning to it. The moment had already done that on its own. Across the room, a television displayed muted news headlines, the scrolling text moving unnoticed by most, while a flight attendant quietly arranged refreshments on a nearby table. Life continued, steady and uninterrupted. Yet for those who had witnessed what unfolded just minutes earlier, something had shifted in a way that could not be easily undone. Back at the check-in counter, Mark stood in a different kind of silence. The line had resumed, passengers stepping forward one by one, but his movements were no longer automatic. Each interaction now carried a pause, a moment of consideration that had not been there before. He greeted the next passenger with care, his tone measured, his attention focused in a way that suggested he was no longer seeing profiles or categories, but people. And though no one spoke of what had happened, the memory of it lingered, quiet but present, shaping the space in ways that could not be seen but could certainly be felt. In the lounge, Sophia leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her gaze drifting toward the runway beyond the glass. Planes moved in the distance, steady and purposeful, each one following a path set long before takeoff. Beside her, the man watched her for a moment, then turned his attention outward as well, his expression calm, his presence grounded. The world outside continued as it always had, but inside that quiet space, something simple and powerful remained. Not the memory of confrontation, not the echo of raised voices, but the quiet clarity of a moment where dignity had been tested, and without force, without noise, it had been fully restored. The boarding announcement came softly through the lounge speakers, a calm and measured voice inviting first-class passengers to prepare for departure. Yet even that familiar call seemed to carry a different tone, as if the morning itself had been quietly reshaped by something no one would officially record. Sophia rose from her seat with the same unhurried grace she had carried from the beginning, smoothing her coat slightly as she reached for her bag. There was no urgency in her movement, no trace of the earlier moment lingering in her expression, yet something about her presence felt more defined now, as if the world around her had finally aligned with a truth that had always been there. The man stood as well, his gaze briefly meeting hers, a silent exchange passing between them that required no explanation. Together, they walked toward the boarding gate, their steps steady, their pace unforced, as though the path ahead had already been cleared long before they arrived. At the entrance to the jet bridge, a flight attendant greeted them with a warm, attentive smile, her posture reflecting the highest standard of service, yet there was a subtle awareness in her eyes as she recognized the man standing beside Sophia. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone sincere, her attention equally balanced between them. Sophia returned the greeting. With a quiet nod, her voice soft as she replied, "Thank you." There was no shift in her tone, no elevation to match the surroundings, only the same calm consistency that had carried her through every moment of the morning. As they stepped onto the aircraft, the cabin revealed itself in soft lighting and refined detail, wide seats arranged with careful spacing, polished surfaces reflecting a quiet elegance that promised comfort without excess. Sophia paused briefly, her gaze moving across the space, not in admiration, but in quiet acknowledgement, as though she understood that luxury, when stripped of ego, was simply another form of design. The man gestured lightly toward her seat, allowing her to take it first, his movements deliberate yet effortless, a quiet habit formed not from protocol, but from respect. She settled into the seat, placing her bag beside her, her hands resting calmly in her lap for a moment before she leaned back, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. He took the seat beside her, his attention briefly shifting toward the window before returning to the present moment, as though even the horizon outside held less significance than the quiet clarity within. The cabin door closed with a soft, final sound, and as the plane prepared for departure, the world outside began to move in slow, steady motion. Back in the terminal, Mark stood at his station, watching the last of the first-class passengers disappear from view, his expression thoughtful, the weight of the morning still settling into something deeper than a simple mistake. The line had thinned, the urgency of the earlier rush replaced by a slower rhythm, yet his approach to each passenger had changed in ways he could not fully articulate. He greeted a woman in casual attire with the same respect he would offer a frequent flyer, his tone steady, his attention focused, no longer guided by assumption, but by intention. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was quiet, subtle, almost invisible, yet it carried meaning far beyond the counter he stood behind. In the cabin, the engines began their low, steady hum, a vibration that signaled movement, progress, continuation. Sophia turned her gaze toward the window, watching as the runway stretched ahead, long and certain, a path defined not by who occupied it, but by where it led. Beside her, the man sat in silence, his presence no longer required to correct anything, only to exist alongside her in a space that needed no explanation. The plane began to move, slowly at first, Then with increasing purpose, the ground beneath them shifting until it finally gave way, lifting them into open sky. And in that quiet ascent, above the noise, above the assumptions, above the moments that had tried to define her, there remained only something simple and undeniable. Not status, not wealth, not power, but the quiet truth that dignity does not ask for permission, and respect, when it is real, does not depend on who is watching. And somewhere far below, in a terminal that had already returned to its ordinary rhythm, the echo of that truth remained, not loud, not forceful, but clear enough that those who had witnessed it would carry it with them, long after the moment itself had passed.